show off my Maestro branded merch whilst everybody's piling in.
I've got mine too.
Ah, nice.
Most used item for sure.
Mm, yeah,
Well,
especially for
Dan, how
folks
you
in.
doing today?
I'm doing really good. I'm doing really good. Obviously, I'm in Europe, and so I am sweltering with the unusual temperatures at the moment. It's going, but yeah, other than that, it's going really good.
Yeah,
Um,
you guys are all complainers.
yeah, I know. There's massive chunks of the world that deal with these temperatures all of the time.
If I
Uh,
hear about the heat wave going on in Europe right now, one more time, no, I'm kidding.
me, I've got aircon.
Yeah, context. I live in Austin, Texas, where it's 35 centigrade plus pretty much every day. So,
No, thank you. Oh dear. Sweet. Well, I think we're probably about the point where slowing down the number of people joining, so I'm going to get cracking. Hi,
right.
I'm Dan. Um, if you have interacted with Maestro via our community Slack or on GitHub, you probably have spoken to me at some point. Um, my role at Maestro, as well as chatting to folks on webinars and stuff. I help people out with their success when they're coming through their first steps in Maestro. I help people out in GitHub in making sure their issues get looked at. And occasionally I pretend to be a coder and actually write bits of Maestro myself. Background wise, I have been a tester for a very long time, and in a bunch of those roles, I picked mobile testing tools. And in the last few, I picked Maestro. I was a Maestro user, then I was a Maestro open source contributor when there was a feature I wanted that wasn't there. Then I joined Slack because I had questions, and I asked a few questions. And then whilst I was there, I went, I know the answer to this one. I know the answer to this one. Helped out a bit there, then became a Maestro customer. And that became a slippery slope towards then eventually wearing a Maestro t-shirt and pinning my mortgage on Maestro. Um, Today, the last few webinars I've done have been about I did a couple on Studio, then I've done a couple, and so has Simon, on how to use the MCP in terms of building up your test suite and in maintaining your test suite. And today is going to be slightly more developer centric. What I'm going to do today is chat about how to fold Maestro into an agentic development pattern. It comes with some level of preparation in that I used Claude to write an application this morning. Um, and so expect an exciting live demo. Um, there's going to be a few bits in here. So some of this is setting up quality, right? If you are a person who is adding features to an application and you're using an agent to help, everybody knows you've got a probability engine, and that feature is going to have Claude's hands on it, but your name against it. Um, and so Maestro, folding Maestro into that cycle lets you test your features before you hand it to somebody else and potentially embarrass yourself. But failing that, you are setting up for quality. You're making sure that you are moving that testing instead of waiting for a PR to be reviewed or to be merged. You're moving that testing a little bit to the left. I'm going to be talking about good agent instructions because, as with most things, a lot of success here comes with having a good Claude.md, Agents.md, something like that. And just because you're testing as you go doesn't mean that you're not even considering the rest of the pipeline. So we're going to cover like maybe how some of that testing that you're doing as part of your development cycle then becomes part of regression testing later on. Cool. Uh, Assuming that everybody hasn't immediately quit because it sounds rubbish, I will crack on with a good demo.
And this is just my friendly reminder. We're watching the Q&A area. So along the way, if you got questions, I'll be flagging Dan down And then Simon is also here and he'll be helping answer questions. So don't hesitate to post any that you got. And then
Yeah.
at the end, for anything Maestro related that's not on kind of this what Dan's walking through, we're happy to kind of hang on and answer any questions y'all got if you're, just coming for that.
Sweet. Don't feel you need to be polite, Jake. If I'm mid-sentence, feel free to interrupt at any point. Right, let's crack on. So, this is a React Native application that I made this morning. You can see on the far right, I've got a Claude session going, and I've got Maestro MCP Viewer there. But I want to start by talking about the CLAUDE.md file that's been built along the way. So I started off with instructions that says, like, I want this file kept current. And as part of that, so this is only probably, I don't know, 10 steps through a development journey in this application. But as part of that, this gets built up, and we're storing knowledge as we go. One of the important parts as we come through this is not only kind of talking about like this is the structure I want, and I want to include tags, and occasionally when I say device, of course, I mean like the simulators and emulators I've got running. Um, but this is probably the core part of this file that I wanted to point out. I haven't written any of it, but I came up with the idea and made my agent do it. Um, Whenever a feature is added or changed, validate it live through Maestro MCP before considering it done. Right? That for me is the core part of a good quality agentic pipeline. Um, as part of all of this, like it's recorded some information about running the flows that it can do itself. Never does it this way. It will always use the Maestro MCP where it can. It's part of this file, so there's some boring structural stuff further on up. But I want to point to some stuff further on down. It's picked up some stuff about debugging. So, like an iOS device got disconnected and it got this. It's talked about conventions for new flows that it thinks are good ideas. Again, these aren't driven by me. It's kind of these are ideas that it thinks are good ideas. Some of that is through trial and error. Some of that is the Maestro MCP includes the ability to look up the Maestro documentation. And so it's able to take some surface level information from docs it's read and kind of go like, great, based on that instruction right at the top of the file and restore that. I might need that later. Um, I gave it some hints around Maestro Cloud to explore around the edges of that. Told it where it could find my Cloud API key. Told it the organization and project that I'm going to be working with in Maestro Cloud. Because if we want to do a couple of tests, I've got that ready. Where I've been able to, as part of the testing, say like I want to test this on a different device, not one of the ones I'm running. Do it on cloud. Um, and so that's a kind of a rough outline of how I built this Claude.md file. I want to point out now my last experience of adding a feature. So you can see here, this is what the application looks like. It is a very simple application that is just a counter. So all we've got inside of here, so this is mirroring the iOS one at the moment. All you've got is the ability to add and subtract. Um, the application was all built in this session over here. The last feature I added was adding this little bit of decoration up at the top of the screen, adding a Maestro logo and the uh, and the counter text. So the description I gave, well, that's not even 100 words. I'm imagining if you were doing this for real, as a professional, you might come with a slightly more well-defined feature than what I've written there. Um, I gave it a, I gave it a file. I gave some information about about ordering and about sizing. Um, but I really haven't gone to town on making a large definition. Um, then you get a really good cycle that comes through here. So first of all, it didn't like my SVG And so I said I thought it might not. So I said like feel free to replace it, and it did. It's used stuff on the system to convert it into a PNG. It's then gone through and done an implementation. It's then immediately broken the iOS simulator. That was the stuff that we saw further on back there. Um, but we're still able to install the application and use XC Run to be able to inspect the device. Then, as we get further on down, it then switches over to Android and realizes the Android implementation is wrong based on simply just that analysis of the image. So the test has immediately had some value. It's gone through, fixed that, retested it, happy, and then we work through going putting the fixing the iOS test a little bit. It's as part of its tests, it realized it had a timeout for a cold load because I've been using Metro. I've been cheating a little bit and using Metro as part of my testing. So I'm imagining anybody doing rapid stuff is going to be normally. If you chatted to me in Slack, I would advise everybody to always do release builds of React Native when testing Maestro. Turns out I'm a massive hypocrite because when I wanted a fast cycle, I used the Metro bundler, and it decided it wanted a delay and then wrote an incorrect test script. And so instead of trying to do an assert visible with a timeout, it realized it needed to do something here. And went went ahead and fixed up the rest of it. So now I think what I want to do now, um, and then at the end, let's check out my flows on Maestro Cloud. What I want to do now, I think, is add another feature and repeat the stuff that I've done in preparation, which luckily turned out to make for a great demo. I want to go ahead and add another feature. One of the things I thought was interesting in here when I was scrolling through a second ago, someone, this. Now, this is something that I haven't asked for because I asked for a very simple application, but it's actually suggested more features for later. Um, and so I'm having a quick look here and is there a good one here? Unit tests, boring. That's going to be any good for my show. Independent counters. Uh, okay, I'm going to be boring. I'm going to pick the reset button. So that's our feature. I'd like a reset button to reset the count back to 0. Probably refine that slightly further. What do you think? Probably place the reset button. Place the reset button centrally below the increment, decrement buttons. Is there anything else you really need to say about a reset button? Um, Super. Right. Let's move things around so we can watch the Maestro Viewer. So this is bundled inside the MCP. If people haven't seen this already, I know when you're writing code, you don't you might if you're in like accept if you're not in accept edits mode, you might look at review the code step by step. If you are doing Maestro stuff, being able to watch it do like it's a good example. These are all run on cloud, but like you don't get much in the way of feedback inside your session. Having the Maestro viewer lets you see all of the commands that we're running, including when iOS went a bit horribly wrong there. And you can see a screen preview. I can even interact with the app here. So this viewer comes embedded inside the MCP, so you can follow along and interrupt the MCP if you're a bit like you're doing this wrong and give it some more context. Um, Clear the history there. And so we should be able to watch it add this. I have no idea how viable this feature is. It seems pretty easy, but the application I wrote this morning, I've not read the source code. Proper vibe coding, I guess. I'm assuming, again, professionals doing this in the real world for real applications that you care about. I'm going to go ahead and assume that people are still reviewing code and stuff out there. Um, um, Now, obviously, like I've given some ideas, some input as we've gone into the for the Claude.md. As an organization, we publish an MCP, but what we don't do is publish any skills. That was a bit of a choice at the time because we feel like um, if we were to publish skills, they wouldn't be contextual to your application, your environment, your development patterns. Um, I think what the best thing I can do at the end of this session is I might put this terrible application and the Claude.md that I've built up, I'll put this into Maestro's GitHub a little bit later on. Um, and so at least there is an example of how you might build up your own agent instructions, but also be able to do things like you can build skills off the back of these instructions. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's wrapped in this kind of in these instructions that I would pull out as a skill. Things like the configuration that I might use for Maestro Cloud, because I would say, well, actually, I could hold it in agent instructions, but I might want to just wrap up actually based on my pretend company's analytics. Like iOS 26 is the primary, but Android API 35 or Android 15 is our most popular based on our analytics, but always test API 30 as well because we've had issues there before or something. And so have a skill that says, right, when you finish testing, when you think you're done, run a cloud run and include these API versions. There's a few things I'd wrap up as skills there. Just to make things a little easier. Oh, a prompt, right? Reset works and looks right. It's centered below the plus minus row. Yeah, looks kind of like what I imagined. Um, Reset validated green. How should it be covered in the Maestro suite? So it's giving us choices now on tests. So whilst it's run some tests here, and it's taken a screenshot to validate it. Part of the instructions were to prompt me about whether or not I wanted to keep it. There's a whole bunch of folks out there now who are doing disposable automation. At this point, with maybe a slightly different agents file, you could consider that actually I never care about anything but the very simplest of smoke tests. All of my new features, I might update my smoke tests, but actually for a lot of this, I just want you to validate it before I open my PR. I'm never gonna care about having like really deep, really expansive regression tests because my app is moving so fast that it just adds maintenance. And so I'm not going to bother. And so I want to include a prompt and say, like, right, so for whatever feature we're building, do we want to include it? So we've got, at the moment, there are two tests that are not wildly representative of a real world suite. So I've got a counter, which is the first one that was built, and it is behavioral, which is tested 3 times, increment works, decrement works, and you can't decrement further than 0. Seems like nice behaviors. The elements one, it's a much shorter test. I'm launching the app and I'm checking that all of the elements that I'm expecting to be there when I start my test are there. So I'm now being prompted. I can check for the presence of the button and the behavior of the button. I can have separate. I think I'm actually going to go for other here, and I'm going to say, no. What I was going to suggest, no, that's this one. Yeah, I want it in and add it to yeah, let's do that. Let's add it to both. Super. So I'm going to have this one. I've done this one first. Brilliant. And now it's editing the other one. I imagine if I had set this up slightly more sensibly with different splits of tests, um, I think typically for a feature like this, you would probably add one test, add one test, add one test. If you were doing this in the real world, you might have one test per feature. You might choose to have, for a simple app like this, you might choose to have one test. It's a tour of both the elements and of all of the behaviors as well. So depending on what your testing strategy is like, um, and again, that probably depends on the kind of app you're building. If you are building an application that is about being a utility like this, um, then any any pattern you choose is going to work quite well. If you're building a shopping application, people are going to be very task oriented. People are going to want to drive from the left to the right. And they're gonna have loads of different routes to get there, but you care about the checkout process, and so you might care about variations on a checkout flow. Whereas if you were writing tests for something like Blue Sky or Reddit, your ideal is to hold people there, at which point there is no clear route through your application, at which point you test at a feature by feature level. So if I were treating this like Reddit, I would test the increment and decrement buttons, I would test the reset button, I would test launching, and I would keep my tests isolated by feature at that point. Cool. Um, what have we done? We've tested the counters. That's all working nicely from group from iOS. Da da da. Run an iOS driver. Only platform change validated only on iOS. Android emulator pick it up on next launch. Real Android life. Super. Yeah. Um, so the Maestro MCP has got the ability to talk to Maestro Cloud at the moment as well. It will pick up. So I've given instructions on where to find those bits that you would normally pass in the CLI or via a GitHub action if you were doing that already. Um, we're expanding that at the moment, so you're going to be able to do more of a loop using Maestro Cloud. So to being able to get more of the artifacts, more of the things that you're able to see in Maestro Cloud's console, you're going to be able to uh, pull back into the agent and be able to do more analysis, so that you're able to then do far more with access to a local running Android emulator or iOS simulator. It's going to be really cool. Um, cool.
On a
Oh,
quick
we
question,
reboot.
Ben.
Yeah, go for it. Yes, please.
Um, Ben Winters is asking, any thoughts on using a release build combined with EAS updates as the development loop for Maestro TDD? Is there another flow that you typically use?
Hmm. Um, given that Maestro doesn't care about what's on your screen, right? So like your traditional way of doing this would have been using Maestro Studio. You would connect to a device and then you'd push buttons. For anybody who saw one of the Blue Sky examples that I did about a month ago, you're driving a device, right? It doesn't care that your application happens to be on the screen. You can run assertions on the clock or the Wi-Fi state or something if you want to. You can drive your way through the entire device. A long way of saying, yeah, EAS updates should absolutely work. Yeah, that sounds like a really good pattern. If you're already using EAS as build service, yes, you could do it that way. You can also, probably a sensible thing to do before I were to put this on GitHub would be to either create an EAS workflow that attaches to it or a GitHub Actions workflow for it. And it's either of those. If I was doing GitHub, I would build in GitHub and then use our cloud action. If I was doing EAS, I do exactly the same thing. So there is a Maestro action and a Maestro cloud action in EAS. Maestro runs it on their tin, but you'll run all of your tests sequentially. Maestro Cloud, you'll be able to use the parallelism that's in Maestro Cloud. So this is doing runs now. If I bring this up, I've not given a go to using EAS updates, but I love the idea of being able to use that as a pattern. That does seem really good fun. Um, cool. One of them's already completed. Go take a look at this one. It's already running, so you'll be able to see like step by step. We're keeping screenshots, but when it finishes, you'll have a full video. But as it's going, you can get some kind of live view of how the test is going. And then if we go back, go see how iOS is getting on. Two devices are preparing. So every time you launch test in Maestro Cloud, you're going to get a brand new device each time. So the state of one test never affects another. So if we got two running tests, it's going to build two brand new iOS simulators. Those, oh, that was fast. And those iOS simulators are then going to run your app, and then at the end of your run, those simulators are destroyed. So there is never a chance that your data affects any future test of yours, and certainly never ever touches anybody else. Back here. Ah, boring. Super, that's done. Your get Cloud Run status. Happy, happy. And so I think at that point, I would probably consider this feature to be both implemented, well tested, Git push over the PR. Um, if I look back over here, maintaining good agent instructions, testing as you go, considering the whole pipeline, we talked about that a little bit. But I think probably the biggest takeaway here is about maintaining your agent instructions in order to incorporate Maestro at the same point that you incorporate Expo into that workflow to be able to say, like, this is how I build and this is how I test. It's kind of all I was planning to do in terms of prepared demo. But depending on what the question, on which route the questions go, I can absolutely dive back in and take a look at trying some more things.
Yeah, so we got one more question that came in from Brendan Hanneman. Could you share the CLAUDE.md instructions you added somehow?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So
you
what
did
I'll
at the
do
top.
is I'm going to shove this entire terrible app into Maestro's GitHub account, and so it'll be tied to our company name forever. But it'll include this Claude.md. There is um, intentionally there's nothing secret in here. The closest you get to a secret is that like there's an org ID and a project ID. The API key is in an env, so I've got an env.example and a .env that I won't commit that includes my key. And so from there, I will from there, yeah, all of this is perfectly safe to share. Um, I'd be interested to see other folks who've used Maestro in an agentic fashion. I'd be interested to see how they might do a Claude.md differently.
Awesome.
That's a long way of saying yes, yes, I will.
Yeah, we're light on questions so far. We've kind of just had, yeah, this whole like folks are still on though. We still got like 50 people. Um, so yeah, I don't know, Dan, maybe you could show some like iterations of like what you can do with cloud as well, like changing device types, showing some of the parallel
Mhm.
runs, other things like
Yeah, absolutely. So, part of the Claude instructions that it's gotten there has come from um, I gave the I gave the agent instructions to investigate what might happen if I said something like uh, this is on Android API 33 through 36. I wanted to be that facility. And so in order to be able to facilitate it being able to do something like that, give me my terminal back. Um, the agent went ahead and ran uh, Maestro list cloud devices. Um, so it had a sense of what was going on behind the scenes, what were its capabilities. So it can see all of the different model and OS combinations that are possible. Um, so if I asked it for an iPad, it would have that kind of context and it would know where to go in order to get it. It's got a tool built in. So the tool, so I've run the CLI version, but the MCP has the tool equivalent of this built in. Um, that's going to be really useful. So um, from a React Native point of view, most of the time you don't care. The same way you don't care that you're running a test on a simulator, React Native renders text and elements to the screen exactly the same way. So no matter whether you're running on Android API 31 versus 36, right? The native framework's going to take care of that for you. Where you will care is where you start looking at things like push notifications, where you start looking at things like file uploads. As soon as you start touching a native layer and you're going across the React Native bridge into doing stuff that's with the operating system, at that point you're going to want to start doing those kind of cross-cut those tests that have cross-cutting concerns. Let's go have a look and see how. So it's worked out. It needs to do multiple runs. If we go across to here and go have a look at Android, let's go check that it's done that successfully. Um, so 33 is running, still doing more. Um, and so the that's kind of how I've gotten myself set up. Like again, I would expand my CLAUDE.md file, I think, over time if I had loads of devices because, I was a big enterprise and I'm doing this and I want to move quickly, I would encode that sort of knowledge about I'm going to encode those decisions of risk into my agents file so that it's then kind of doing a lot of that stuff for me, or at least if I think it might be in any way contentious, I will say kind of, if you think it might need it, ask me if you want me to, um, work through all of that. So let's go. Let's take a quick look at this. 33 is done. 34. I think I might need to change my setup here because I think this is running sequentially, and that's not really what I wanted. I wanted to fire these off asynchronously and poll for them later. I'll take a look at that. Maybe I'll have a look at trying to iterate on that bit of the MD file before I upload it, or maybe do it as a couple of commits. So that iteration with cloud devices gives a second benefit as well, because if you are one of those unlucky few folks out there who are doing all of your work on a Windows machine, you don't need an iOS device locally because you'd be able to do it using a Windows machine because you can just use the iOS devices in the cloud. Where we haven't got any failures in here, but where there is a failure, what I'm hoping that you're going to be able to get to with an MCP loop is that all of this information that's available here. So all of this is already available. More of these artifacts is what I was talking about earlier. The artifacts you have at the moment, it's not going to be a lot interesting in here for a passing run, but what you can see is so device log straight away, yours, the entire all of the history there. So if you've got a sensible grown-up application instead of something that was literally born this morning, you've probably added sensible telemetry in as well. So you'll be able to, you've probably got, when you're making API requests, you're launching your application, you've got sensible things that are already being logged. Those are going to help you. When you get a failure in Maestro, you're also going to get things like screenshots of what was happening when it failed, a hierarchy. I should probably explain a hierarchy actually. That would be a handy thing for me to quickly show. Look at terminals. So
I
Maestro
loop in
hierarchy.
real quick,
Yeah,
just
go
on
for it.
a similar topic. Though Simon did kind of answer this, but um, does it matter if you're working from a dev build or a release build or anything like that?
Um, the only thing that I've included in my CLAUDE.md file is that down here where I'm talking about Maestro Cloud, um, you need to do a release build when you're using Maestro Cloud because Maestro Cloud won't be able to access your Metro bundler, right? It's not going to be able to go come back to your machine. It's not going to be able to come and see that connection. And Maestro Cloud doesn't run any of that. It's not going to be able to do that for you. And so there is a bit in here that says do a release build. And that way when you do your release build, you'll be able to get uh, it'll run the fully fledged version. That is, I hope, also what you would do for your release builds when you're thinking about shipping your app. You're gonna put a proper APK through Maestro Cloud anyway because you're gonna want to test the thing closest to what your users are going to be doing. Um, Going to do a quick demo of what Maestro hierarchy looks like. Maestro hierarchy is an insight into what Maestro's view of the screen is. You see some of this if you've used Maestro Studio, you're seeing kind of like you're able to mouse over and see bits. Um, but if I show the output of Maestro hierarchy in a terminal here, um, yes, um, the Maestro hierarchy of the device is a JSON representation of every element that is visible on the screen. Right. So if I just kill the iPhone for a second rather than mucking around with command line switches, I will, if I run the hierarchy, you'll be able to see in here, again, this is part of the debug information that you would be able to get out of Maestro Cloud when you get a failure. And it's also what your MCP will use locally. If you get a failure locally, this is exactly the same information it's going to use locally. And so you can see here, there's battery being at 100% at the top there. Um, you can see that there's the Wi-Fi signal. Um, Open debugger to view warnings. Yeah, there's a React Native debugger warning there on the screen. Um, so I'm assuming if I had any more scroll back in my terminal, you would get back to the point of being able to see you have to see the other elements. If I were actually debugging by hand, like this is what I would have done. If you'd asked me about this a year ago, I would have said, well, Maestro Studio hasn't even been invented yet. And so I'm working in Visual Studio Code. I'm writing all of my YAML by hand. And if I hit a problem, I'm gonna run Maestro hierarchy. I'm gonna pop it out to a hierarchy.json file. Um, and from there, I'm gonna work through debugging bit by bit the hierarchy that I'm seeing and what it is I need to look for. Great. So I want an increment button. Get great. My increment button's there. The bounds look about right, and I'm going to debug all that. Now with the MCP, um, I'm going to be creating tests in seconds rather than minutes as it was before. So yeah, that's all part of the debug information you would get out of Maestro Cloud if a failure were to occur, which then means you're going to be able to create that loop of like, here's my tests, try it on everything. If you get a failure, fix the tests or fix the application. Again, as you encode more of your business context into your agents file, you are going to be able to help ascertain where there is an indecision about that difference between if I've got a test failure, is the test failure my test is broken or is my test failure my app is broken? And that is about local context and about what's going on. What have I just changed? Is this a test from last week that hasn't been updated because everybody's changed stuff since last week? Or is this a feature I've just added and that's broken other things? And so again, I would look to for a production application, be looking to encode more of that decision making into the agent's MD and doing that as you find it. So, like again, if I played with this application for another week, that agent's MD, the CLAUDE.md file would get longer over time.
More quick question.
Yeah.
Ansur Raman is asking, is it possible to add MCP or Claude into Maestro Studio so that we can do all the automation on one platform? Also,
Um,
when connecting physical devices, sometimes the viewer does not show the app view.
um,
Is there a
so
specific way to do it?
Um, there are some improvements around that. I think they're unreleased in. So to the second question, I think there are some improvements to that. They're gonna look a lot better in the very next release of Maestro. Go look at the main branch, the source code. There's stuff already there about connections to Android devices. We've done a lot of work on that over the last couple of weeks. There's been an enormous amount of change in the code base over specifically and Android devices and stability. It also helps us reason better when people have problems about what those problems might be. Um, as for putting the MCP in Studio, that's interesting. I'd always considered them to be different audiences, but clearly some folks would find that useful. I think saying that if MCP had been in Studio, I probably would have done this demo differently. I probably would have demoed it from here, had an MCP working here. Connecting up is interesting. I It's interesting. Would you use the MCP? You have the MCP on the right and the device on the left. Would you still use the device inspections? Um, I feel like I when I'm developing tests or when I'm debugging tests, I'm choosing to use one or the other, largely depending on how well set up I am um for having my agent look at that particular repository. Um, I think if I've got that, I might not use Studio. Um, Looking at an app that's given me to build a suite from scratch, file, I would probably use Studio initially, create the first few tests, so you've got that prior art in place and say, there, that's what good tests look like. That's what you're going to need for stuff like my application, especially if you've already got some existing stuff like I've got I might have a hook at the top, an on-flow start hook that calls out to my login flow, or I need to make a JavaScript call to set up some data on my back end. Having that prior art there is going to be really useful because the MCP isn't going to intuit that. Um, I think that yeah, I think that'd be useful. Be interesting to
Cool.
do a webinar just on that actually.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a great question. Okay, we got a couple others. Alexi was like, he was like, why doesn't Maestro show the line number when a test fails?
Hmm. Um, that's interesting. So having a line number, we're talking about a line number against a YAML file. Um, I suppose I suppose in some cases that makes sense. Quite often, I mean, like I guess this test is a little bit unusual in that a lot of these lines are repeats of other lines. I'm trying to think under what like hopefully the error that's surfaced is kind of human readable rather than machine readable. I'd be interested to know what the value to the line number is. I suppose if you were doing it by hand, if you were manually doing maintenance that allows you to jump to the right place in the file. If I got a failure in Cloud, the first thing I would do is open Studio and run the same test in Studio. At which point I'm going to get an error at that point, and I'm already going to know where I am. Um, Having the line number, I guess having the line number, if it were a text change, could be useful, where you get there and kind of go like, uh, oh no, yeah, it was decrement, but actually, this afternoon I chose to change it to decrease instead, and so I can do a one-line text change without I need to do extra runs, maybe. But yeah, I would love to chat more about that. Come and find me on Slack. So if you go to slack.maestro.dev and join our public Slack community, I would love to chat more about the other use cases I've not considered for that because that's probably not a wildly difficult thing to add. And so if people are going to find it useful, yeah, I don't, I'm not against it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, what was another one? Let's see. How do you handle flaky tests or tests that pass in local but failed in the pipeline? For example, they're using GitHub Actions and then executing in browser stack. Yeah,
Um,
that's a shameless plug for where our cloud kind of is more purpose built and makes it a lot easier for iterating on this. But that's a tale as old as time. I feel test failures working locally and then in the cloud. I think we purpose built this thing for just running Maestro and making it really seamless to go from local to cloud there. But what's your take on it, Dan?
yeah, totally. If your device is something you use every single day, so your local emulator ends up being like over time it drifts from that clean device state, you can end up with those sorts of quirks. By and large, if you're launching a standard emulator, what you're going to get in cloud is going to be really similar. The cloud devices are the same things that you get from Apple or from Google, with the exception of some little bits of preparation that we do over the top that makes the device be a little bit more second use. So like Chrome, you get the first time nag, those pop-ups that you get like, try our Siri intelligence things. Like get rid of all of that. Shush. Like I'm like that's not what I'm after. I want to test the device. Where you're looking at more generic device farm type folks, you might not get that same level of preparation because you might be using the device for something other than Maestro. Um, Browser Stack also use a fork of Maestro. They've done some stuff to make it work in their farm, so I don't know how well they track um, us as the upstream. Um, but in terms of those changes about things that fail in your pipeline, yes, I've been looking largely at device differences. You can have performance fakes where I've got a test that says tap on A, then tap on B, then tap on C, and those are on different screens. But actually, there's an API call in between each one. And locally that works real fast because I'm only 3 meters away from the server, but the cloud is somewhere else and something like that. And so actually tap on C doesn't work because even though tap on will include some waiting, actually this API request has been slower, and it takes like 10 seconds to bring the data back, and so it fails. In those instances, you then maintain your tests. You make them more reliable. You say like, right, tap on A, assert something on the next screen and wait for it to be visible, then tap on B. Then and so you're defending against slow data loading in your tests by putting those sorts of things in place and saying like, I know data will have loaded when this appears, then perform my next action. Then I will know that data will have appeared. Right? That is how idiomatically writing your test in the same way that a user would perform the test. If you were still using manual QAs doing the same test with thumbs, they are going to push button A, wait for data to load, then push button B, then wait for, and so writing a test in a similar fashion will normally put you in a good stead. I've covered a couple of different flaky situations. If you've got more, let me know because I might have other advice. Hopefully that covers it.
Yeah, find us on Slack. I think it was Megha. Uh, so yeah, absolutely come find us if you got more questions. And yeah, try out our cloud service. When you got stuff like that, then it just makes it a lot easier if you are running into that for us to help you fix it and iterate on it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to a cloud service is going to give you 7 days free anyway, so you can for iOS and for Android, and so you can absolutely muck around with that. The MCP itself is all entirely free; it's all part of the open source project. It has the ability to read all of our docs. It will do a shallow plug for Gitbook because I love Gitbook. Gitbook make it very, very easy for MCP to read our docs because all of your web pages are also surfaced as Markdown, which is beautiful for working in an agentic world. So thank you, Gitbook. We love you. Um, um, and so Um, so if cloud isn't suitable for you, because I don't know, one of my previous roles, I did a whole bunch with Bluetooth connectivity. So as whilst I was a Maestro Cloud customer and ran 80% of my tests there, I had a whole separate Maestro suite that was to do with Bluetooth connections of devices and stuff that lived in this room, right? And so I had separate stuff there. Now, all of the Maestro MCP and its ability to access the docs and all of that is all entirely free. Like if you only need to do stuff that is sitting in your room and you're willing to do test one followed by test two followed by test three followed by test four, um, then yeah, by all means, like you can do that for free using the open source stuff right now. But once you've tried cloud and use parallel stuff, you're gonna find it annoying.
Awesome. I think we've got everything covered.
Sweet.
Um,
Um, if you think of more questions, come find us on Slack. I know I've plugged that a few times, but I genuinely love that part of my job. Um, so yeah, do come along. I will try and tidy up this project slightly and get it on GitHub. I will do that, I hope tomorrow. And then if this session appears to have been useful and well recorded, I will shove it on YouTube and I'll link all the things together and so people can come back and listen to me all over again.
good stuff, Dan. Way to Agentic live demo, and it all works, man.
Yeah. Claude wrote the slides too.
Heck yeah. Good job, Claude. Yeah.
Also,
Yes.
I'm not
Yeah.
really.
A few people want to see the share the MD with Dev Build project. Yeah. So I feel like people
Yes,
would love to see that.
yes,
Good.
absolutely. I will put it all on GitHub. I will do that tomorrow. I promise. Um, I won't share the slides. There's nothing of value there.
Awesome. Good. Good work. Thanks everyone for joining us. Find us on Slack. We'll see you next time.